Well, readers like Kingsbridge. Kingsbridge actually has its own fan club. And I introduced Kingsbridge in The Pillars of the Earth and then used it again in World Without End and A Column of Fire. And people seem to have enjoyed watching the progress of this city over the centuries. And I've enjoyed writing it. And so I began to think, well, what was it like before? Was there a time when Kingsbridge wasn't an important, thriving city? Was there a time perhaps when it was a village or even a hamlet? And that began to intrigue me. And at the same time, I began to think about what time period this story might be set in. And I thought of the beginning of the 11th century, round about the year 1000, when three powerful groups were competing for control of England. The Anglo-Saxons, of course, who lived there. The Vikings, who for 200 years had been treating England like a supermarket where you didn't have to pay, and raiding and stealing and slaving. And the Normans, who were probably the most civilized group in Europe, who were, of course, the people who eventually did take control of England and are still here. So the combination of the early days of Kingsbridge and this terrific power struggle during the 11th century struck me as a combination which would give me terrific drama and great stories. Well, the bottom line is, if nobody knows the answer to a historical question, then the novelist is allowed to make it up. So in cases, for example, nobody knows what underwear, if any, the Anglo-Saxons wore. And so I've made it up. And probably nobody will ever know. Nobody will ever challenge what I've invented. And, you know, what I've invented is pretty plausible, and I bet, if ever we did find out, I bet it would turn out to have been right. There are some really interesting evidences left of this period. One is the Viking Ship Museum in Oslo, where there are Viking ships mostly which have survived, you know, 1,000 years, partly reconstructed, but mainly original. And they are quite stunning. They are both beautiful and terrifying. And then in Bayeux in Normandy, there is the famous Bayeux tapestry, which is a work of embroidery, 58 meters long, a strip cartoon, that tells the story of the Norman invasion of England, but also gives us a host of interesting details about ordinary life in those times. So there are some sources, and I milked them for everything I could get. Yes, I think so. The real historical figures are usually fairly distant in my story. I focus on ordinary people who are fictional characters, but they're affected by what is done by kings and princes and queens and popes and so on. Really, what I'm trying to do in these stories is show how the great seismic events of history were actually driven by the feelings and beliefs of ordinary people and the choices that ordinary people made. And so I don't rely on the real figures very much, generally speaking, but I take what they did and I show how ordinary people were involved in that. Some books. There is a famous manuscript called the Book of Kells, which I went to see when I was in Dublin. It's at Trinity College, Dublin. There are some. There's the Exeter Book of Riddles is an interesting book because it's not biblical, it's not religious, and it tells us a little bit about the sense of humour of the Anglo-Saxons. Very few paintings and drawings of any kind, mostly in illuminated manuscripts. And the Anglo-Saxons didn't build much in stone. So I have visited, I would say, probably most of the Anglo-Saxon buildings in England, but there aren't many. There are more fragments, bits of Anglo-Saxon stonework that have survived in churches which were extended and built over in later centuries. And I've looked at quite a lot of those, and they're quite helpful. But once again, there is in Normandy a lot more building from this era. Because by this time the Normans had started to build castles, which the Anglo-Saxons never did. Anglo-Saxons never built castles. So we can see what civilization was doing in other parts of Europe, but it wasn't doing very much in England. Very much. The Bayeux Tapestry is a great resource for anybody trying to find out about this period of time. It has a very sort of down-to-earth air, but the details are good. So, for example, if you want to know about the tack used on horses, the bridles or various different reins, bits, stirrups. You can see a lot of that in the Bayeux Tapestry. There's a certain amount about food in the Bayeux Tapestry. There's a picture of people having a dinner party, eating and drinking, and of the servants cooking the meal for them and serving it. A lot about battle, of course. We see a lot about battle, a lot about ships, because there was a lot of traffic crossing what is now called the English Channel. So yes, the Bayeux Tapestry is a most tremendous historical resource. I visited the original in Normandy, and there is also a marvellously accurate copy in a museum in England in the town of Reading. Well, we learn a certain amount about boat building in the Dark Ages by looking at the remains of ships. And the Viking Ship Museum in Oslo is the greatest resource from this point of view. And the ships there are partially restored, but to a great extent original. There is also information about shipbuilding in the Bayeux Tapestry, because Duke William of Normandy, before he became King William I of England, had to commission the building of a fleet of ships to take his invasion force across the Channel to England. And in the tapestry, we see them chopping down the trees. We see them smoothing the planks with a tool called an adze. We see them putting the planks together to form the ship. And we then see them launching the ship and sailing across the English Channel in ships absolutely jam-packed with soldiers and horses and weapons. So we can learn a certain amount. Once again, we don't know everything because what physical evidence we've got has deteriorated. And so once again, I may have had to make up one or two things. But basically, the story of the ships of the time is actually quite well known. Well, Edgar is like Tom in that he has an instinct for shapes and structures. And I compare it to an instinct for music. Some people naturally get music as children, and even toddlers, they can carry a tune. They know when a tune is good and when it's just a noise. Some people have that instinct, and some people have an instinct for shapes. Some people can draw effortlessly, and some people, I'm one of the people who can't, to save my life. And actually the building skill that Tom and Edgar both have is something that I absolutely don't have, which perhaps is why I admire it so much. I did, when writing The Pillars of the Earth, I was fascinated by how those stonemasons worked with the very primitive tools that they had at their disposal, basically hammer and chisel. And the chisel was not made entirely of steel. If they were lucky, it might have had a steel tip. Steel was very expensive. So I was fascinated by the idea that these men, with their rather inadequate tools, built the most beautiful buildings in Europe. That was the beginning of my fascination with this business of men and women. Actually, women built the cathedral as well as men. Men and women who could make things and make them well and soundly, buildings that would stand up and ships that would float. I find that fascinating, and I've enjoyed sharing some of that fascination with readers. Ragnar is a Norman princess, and like many of the women in my stories, she's smart and beautiful and sexy and feisty. You know, I sometimes answer this question by saying I never met any other kind. I'm surrounded by strong women and very happy to be. Of course, I'm often asked about these women and whether they are really historically accurate. People say, you know, surely in the olden days, women just weren't allowed to be like this. And the fact of the matter is that in every period of history, there are women who defy the conventions and who say, I'm not going to follow your program for me. Women who say, you know, I like hunting and I'm going hunting even if you think it's an indelicate thing for a female to do. So, and they are the ones who are worth writing about. They're the interesting ones. They get into trouble, they rebel. And Ragnar's like that in the evening and the morning. She has a strong will. She gets married against her parents' wishes to an Anglo-Saxon chieftain, and she has to cope with the consequences. Well, aristocratic women could play a role in the law and in government. Abbesses, for example, senior nuns could also play an important role. Ordinary women, probably not so much, but an exceptional woman could rise above the normal status of women. And the model at this time, the woman, the real life woman who proves that actually you can do anything, is called Emma of Normandy. And she, when she was 18, she married the King of England, and she came to live in England. And she was at the centre of power in England for decades afterwards. After Ethelred died, she married King Canute. And one of her sons became King Edward, Edward the Confessor, who built the original cathedral at Westminster Abbey. So she proves that you can, that women could have these roles of importance and power. The legal system in the Dark Ages in England is quite difficult. There are lots of laws, and there seems to have been an effective system of local justice. So there would be, the country was divided into hundreds, and a hundred was a group of villages, and they would meet and hold court at specified intervals, and justice would mostly be done by the people. Whoever presided over the court had a great deal of influence, but it was, at least in theory, a people's court. This did not apply higher up the scale. So justice was dominated at the higher level by the local lord, or alderman as they were called, chieftain I sometimes call them. And the king's power was very circumscribed. Not intentionally. The king made laws, he passed judgment, and some powerful men simply ignored the king. There's a famous case, the legal case of the Dark Ages, about which we know more than any other case. It's the case of Wulfbold. And he defied the king year after year and died without ever doing what the king had ordered him to do. And after he died, his wife carried on defying the king. So all the evidence is there were lots of laws written down, but it was very difficult to, at the higher level, very difficult to enforce them. Yes. One of the surprises in the research for me was the extent to which I was writing about a slave society. The best estimate from the Domesday Book is that about 10% of the population of England were slaves. And that's a serious slave. You know, that's just not a few prisoners of war. That is clearly part of the economic system. And I mean, we know slavery means that you own the person and you can do what you like. And, you know, you weren't really... There was a law that said it was wrong to kill a slave in anger. That's the only law protecting slaves that I have come across. And the punishment was laughable. Punishment was fasting. So clearly there was tremendous opportunity for people to be brutal with their slaves, and I'm sure some of them were. And in the evening and the morning, I show some of that brutality. I don't like overdoing that kind of thing, but you know, it's got to be mentioned. And some people, you know, as no doubt in all slave societies, some people were decent to their slaves and some people absolutely were not. So there's that. There is the battles with the Vikings. There are two battles with Vikings. And those, you know, if you're going to write a battle scene, and you couldn't write about this period without having at least one battle scene, if you're going to write about it, then you've got to describe it, and you've got to describe it as it was, and it was gruesome. Actually, you know, nowhere near so many people were killed and injured as would be in any kind of modern battle where firearms are used, because it's not actually that easy to kill somebody with a spear. You've got to be very strong to actually stick it in. But all of that detail forms part of the picture that I'm trying to paint of a historical period. So yes, there's a certain amount of action in this book. Let me see. I'd have to think. Offhand, I can't think of anybody.